This is a production of Cornell University.
So everybody, thanks for joining. This is the first week in our Golf Symposium webinar series, and this is obviously in partnership with the GCSAA New York chapter. So recently formed chapter. For those not in New York, we kind of consolidated a couple regional chapters recently into the GCSAA NY. So we're putting this on in partnership with them, trying to recreate the educational day that we unfortunately had to cancel early in March. So and big thanks to Suzanne Miss, who's the chapter administrator. Saw her on today. She's helped us logistically kind of organize this stuff. So today we've got Frank Rossi starting with some data-driven management. Considering the pandemic circumstances, and this is our lineup for the upcoming weeks. We're going to have Doug Soldat from Wisconsin talking about optimizing nitrogen fertility next week, and then in 2 weeks we're going to have golf course architect Ian Andrews on with us, talk a little bit about minimal design aspects. So we also did want to thank the partners with the GCSA NY. So our platinum sponsors, we have Andre and Son, First Turf and Ornamental, Grassland, Harrell's. So, us here at Cornell, we worked with these guys too and leaned on them for supporting our research. The gold sponsors, Finch, BASF, Pump Irrigation Technologies, and MTE. And then some silver sponsors as well, right? So Ewing, Syngenta, Nutrient Solutions, Turf and Soil Diagnostics, Weaver Golf and Turf, and Dryject. So a big thanks to all the sponsors here who still supporting this virtual education day. I think with that, Frank, I'll hand it off to you, and we can get started.
Thanks very much, Carl, and another big shout out to the GCSAA. The new GCSA of New York. Let me put this one away and get the other one. Sorry about that. Yeah, big shout out to them. We're going to have we'll have a longer conversation about that when we get to the data-driven component of this. But all of you that know me, know we try to start out with something a little bit funny or positive or cute. And here we go. My man Thad, right away. This is what it looked like outside of Terry Hills, out there in Western New York, one of the three associations that came together to start the Golf Course Superintendents Association in New York. And we are looking forward to welcoming the other chapters that it makes sense to consolidate like this, because look at the cool things that can happen as a result. We can all get together during a global pandemic. Anyway, here we go. Thanks for shouting out, Thad. Anyway, I don't know, inspiration. I look for some. I'm one of those sorts of people, feel like we have a certain amount of responsibility. I know I do. I'm enormously privileged and lucky to have had the chance to work hard and do the things I do. And I think for those of us that can do that, I think sometimes we've got to go beyond our best and what's required. And I think there's a air of social responsibility that we're all being asked to do. And this is our little part as we start our fifth conversation together during the global pandemic. All right, let's do a little housekeeping here as we like to do. And I don't want to wade too deep in these waters. There may be a more recent update. These things are updated sometimes multiple times during the day. But this is what came out that left some confusion last week. It was still there on April 21st. This, I think, provides, it looked confusing to me, essential service such as groundkeeping to avoid hazardous conditions. Does cutting the greens as 1/8 of an inch count as a hazardous condition? So this was obviously greatly ambiguous. And again, the lobbying efforts and all the advocacy efforts at the State House from an economic perspective, really talking about the value of golf in New York, led Senator Daphne Jordan to write a letter on behalf of the golf industry that basically was saying, listen, we think individuals can access the use of carts without the need of course employees. That should be fine. Okay, well, maybe that's something you should think about. And then with proper social distancing and no employees other than limited groundskeeping. Now, again, I don't know what clarification of limited groundskeeping means. That's certainly worthy of discussion before we move into data-driven. But it's been the approach we've been taking all along, that really what I think you have to look at what you're doing in some ways on your golf course a little bit differently than maybe you have in the past. And you may be forced to do it, because of money. You may be forced to do it because of labor. There may be a lot of reasons, but obviously these are the kinds of sort of government overarching things that provide some boundaries for the things we do. Now, I'm an observer like many of you on Twitter and a small participant sometimes. And I really liked what the Michigan GCSA just put out. This is the economic story. This is the story. Look, we just want to make you aware there's a lot of land, a lot of money to charity, into the economy, Michiganders, and we look forward to opening as soon as it's appropriate. I don't, that's like essential. This is a great, I think that's the right sentiment, right? We want, as we open, if we're open, we want to do things that are appropriate. Right. So just so you know, a reminder about your DEC pesticide license in New York State. Right. I thought I'd remind everybody, since we're talking about to the golf course superintendents, at this point in New York State, because of our webinar today, the DEC is really cutting everybody a fair amount of slack here. If your certification lapsed on or after November 1st, so all the way back to November 1st, you can continue, if you're able to work, to use that license until the order or any extensions are issued 60 days after the expiration of that order. So you'll see you got a little bit of time. There's, I don't believe, and Carl continues, I think, to support this, that the DEC is not currently in the mood to approve credits yet that I'm aware of, and we'll see if that's going to change over time. All right, let's talk about golf openings. The National Golf Foundation continues to provide really great data for the golf industry about the business of golf. And I think this is a fascinating topic for me as a biological scientist. I don't really know a lot about business, which is good because I ask really stupid questions that sometimes, wow, I didn't think about that before. So if you see the way that the golf courses are opening and closing, right? Nobody was closed in March 21st. Now the weather might not have been very good, but here we are on the 21st, 23rd, 24th, and we're still under some weirdness here in New York State. Now, let's look at another way. This is using census data. Each of these colored regions, and I believe, let's look here. There's, I think this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 9 census regions. Maybe there's 10, something like that. So this is organized by census region, right? So let's look at this now. So that's April 6th. So here's April 6th. Oh, sorry. There we go. April 6th. April 13th, you could see right now the northern courses are starting to open. And then this is the big news for us in the Northeast, right? The closures of golf courses in this region around the epicenter right now in the United States is experiencing a pretty significant downturn at a time when these months could be 40% of our entire season. So these are the kinds of things that are driving the discussion, balancing between safety and operating. And I want to come down on it. I don't care. This isn't up to people like me. But if you guys are going to operate, our responsibility is that we all do it smartly. They play smartly and we manage it smartly. So let's just begin to talk about this in our COVID analysis today, and then we'll get into a discussion with Kyle about using data about ABW, and then we'll talk a little bit more about our topic for today, and of course want to have discussion in between there as it's warranted. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This was a picture in the paper of Minnesota. Minnesota's opened up. Now, Minnesota is, in fact, the Scandinavia, Sweden, and Norway of the United States. So this isn't new to this Scandinavian culture. And I don't mean that disparagingly. It's just the nature of those cultures and their social distancing appropriately on the putting surface there. Right? I want to draw your attention to an interesting Cornell resource, right? If you're going to open up, right? If you're going to open up as a golf course in New York State, what do you need to know? Now, obviously the things you need to know on the golf course, but the Cornell Population Center has put together a really nice website here looking at demographic and health vulnerability, right? It's odd enough. Of course, the epicenter is in the New York City area, but if you look at things like how who you are and your pre-existing conditions is related to COVID, it's about a 42% correlation. 42% of the time you can explain COVID problems with who you are demographically and how vulnerable you are. Now, this is worth knowing because you think, well, rural counties are safe. But if you look at this, you see some of the rural counties actually are problematic. And if you look at the way demographics are looked at from a vulnerability perspective, as you open, if you're open, it would be really good to be able to talk to the people that are playing golf about these kinds of things, because this ultimately, until any kind of medical solution comes along, ultimately is the most vulnerable among us. And we should at least know if our golf course is operating in that county. You know, obviously everybody's going to take an amount of care, but wouldn't it be nice to say, well, we're taking extra care because we have a vulnerable population? I believe that's the kind of social responsibility as we're thinking about operating our businesses that we're also thinking. Now, I don't have to tell you, 70% of the rounds in America are performed by people over the age of 55. I mean, most people who play this game by age, not over 80, but by age, could be potentially more vulnerable. And this is important. And I think this is something the front of the house is going to have to do in golf course situations where maybe the PGA professional has to do this, or maybe the club managers have to do this, but somebody is going to have to know what kinds of pre-existing health conditions you have in some way as you try to keep people safe and distance on the golf course. All right. So operating the golf course, right? So in short order, as expected by me, golf course superintendents, problem solvers by nature, all of you, are going to figure out ways to do this. So I go fishing around for things like this. And Greg Austin, the president of the Canadian Golf Course Superintendents, based out of BC, British Columbia, right? Vancouver, British Columbia, reports on this wonderful draft that all the allied golf associations got together in the British Columbia province to write how we're going to do it. And it's a nice 24, 25-page document. Carl has all the links that he's normally going to put in the chat space and other places where we're going to put it up there. Make sure you take a look at this as we start to build these things. And maybe these things are happening in other places. But what I liked about this is this got into detail. Now, okay, you're a golf course superintendent, you're an assistant, you're just working on a golf course, right? Just think about this part of this one section of one page of a 24-page, 25-page document. Look at all the things that have to get sanitized and disinfected now on a regular basis. But this is going to take time. And my experience so far is we have fewer people, not more people. And so if we're going to work, even if we have a staff to do the work, you're going to have to think about a proportion, 20, 30, 10, I don't know, percentage of your hours that are going to have to be allotted to clean everything. I was talking to Craig Cochran the other day in preparation for a new Frankly Speaking episode came along, and he likened it to, gym protocol. You got to clean everything. You use it, you clean it. Before you get on it, you clean it. You get off it, you clean it. It's one of those gym protocol things, which I think is a good analogy for a lot of guys who, are regular gym visitors. The New Jersey superintendents also have a really good response. I've tried to talk about the regional responses to these things over the first couple of sessions here. And the New Jersey guys came out with a really good little thing from Easy Go about cleaning and sanitizing golf cars and equipment. A nice 4 or 5 page. Listen, I'm opinionless on whether we should open or not. It's not up to me, but I'm telling you, if golf is open and operating, and you guys are managing these operations and trying to cut the grass and prep the place, never mind what's happening at the front of the house, but you're just trying to keep your things in order, right? You're going to have to know these protocols and have some guidelines for how you're going to do it. And my suggestion is it's probably going to have to be written out. Jonathan Haywood, one of the guys that I follow, I don't follow a lot of folks on Twitter. One of the guys I do, Jonathan Haywood's at the Morris County Golf Club. He says his staff that is down 40% for this time of year. Routine tasks are more difficult. There he is wearing his mask. I think all of us are going to have to get used to that sight. I know I'm not going anywhere in public these days in New York where I can't maintain social distance. I go into Lowe's to get some wood. I got to have my mask on the whole time. Can't take it on and off and play around with it on your face, right? You put it on, you keep it on. All right. So what's Jonathan say? Well, he's using more larger ride-on mowers. He's relying on growth regulators. But he's really worried that how's he going to provide these consistent conditions that everybody's gotten used to with less staff and less fertilizer chemical inputs. I thought very well said for a quote, pulling it off of Twitter. Well said, Jonathan. And I think this has got to be on everybody's mind. I mean, I don't think there's a golf course superintendent running a golf course who's not thinking about these same sorts of things, whether the grass is growing or not. All right, let's look at some biology for a second. So, and I'm sorry, some climate weather, some climate data for a second. This is when we started the pandemic. You could see we were still in the 30s, but it looked like things were progressing. You could see here at the bottom, the onslaught of the warm soil conditions temperature, some places in the 60s. All right, now here it is a week later on the 6th. You can see, now we're into the mid 50s. It's going to get going. And then, boom, last week it stalled, and this week it's going backwards. It seems to be going backwards as of yesterday. And you can see very little 50 degrees just in some of the urban centers, right? Maybe that's around Rutgers where everybody's trying to cut the grass. So obviously soil temperature has slowed. This is really good. If you're going to use data, this is the kind of data I would start looking at, because this is a measure of how the soil's going to start contributing to the whole effort to get these plants growing. Now, growing degree days and monitoring how the season progresses is another way to do it. So here's the forecast from the first week. The second week, you could see we moved into the double-digit accumulation. The forecast that we just lived through, where most of us had single digits. And again, it looks like the majority of the Northeast is going to continue to accumulate very few base 50 growing degree days. So obviously that's a stall based on what was happening. Now, you might embrace this if you're, trying to keep up, and you might curse it if now you've got more golfers than, you're used to. Now, a point to that role about traffic in a second. All right, so where are we with growth potential? This is the same slide I've used for 3 weeks in a row, Carl. I haven't changed this slide one bit because we're not even averaging 50 degrees temperature. Ben McGraw, in our conversation with Kyle today, starts out by saying this. All right, you were moving along. It was going good. Everybody was gearing up, fueling up. How are we going to make our adulticide apps? And look at Ben. Look at this comment here. And Kyle, this is the place for us to chat now. This is the longest period between initial ABW emergence and peak that I can remember. So let me get to, sorry about that. Let me get back here, and there we go. Are we looking at each other?
Yep.
Okay. So Kyle, obviously we were progressing. And you were on, and you were like, we're not seeing anything. I sent you some scouting sheets that Mike Hadley sent us from the Bethpage Black, and some of his scouting routines, and it's confirming what you and Ben and everyone's saying. Okay, it's slowed. Now, one of the things that is always on my mind is whenever these guys get bunched up, and I don't know whether this is going to bunch them up or not, but whenever they get bunched up and then go out and have lunch at the same time, so to speak, a lot of grass dies. So it makes an adulticide more important, but I wonder if it also makes it easier to time because they're bunched up. So that's my thoughts. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the sentiment is really still being patient, but staying on your toes because of that potential for things to accumulate quickly. It's pretty surprising what we're seeing around central New York. I think this time last year, we had about 100 degree days by now, reached about 120 by the end of the month, and had peak adults by third or fourth week of April. But even in central New York now, we're still seeing around maybe accumulation of 50 in the 50s for growing degree days, base 50. So, you don't want to get too complacent and relaxed in that, but you also don't want to jump the gun, especially if you're a course that's down to say like 40%, like you were citing earlier from Jonathan's course there, Frank, because I think that could mean people are getting caught off guard. We are seeing some sites though, like the data you shared with me, Frank, where we're seeing peak adult activity already. Downstate, there are a couple of courses where I've heard that's the case. But still some other courses down in that area in Western Mass that still seem like they're maybe a full week out before we're seeing peak adults. So
So what does that mean relative to timing? Okay, if you don't have pyrethroid resistance, let's start there. If you don't have pyrethroid resistance, and you can use pyrethroids as an adulticide, and I'm going to get to that in my data-driven presentation in a minute, some of the work we've been doing. But if you can use pyrethroids, how far do you think most of when you say peak adult, that sounds to me like if I'm using an adulticide, I should get out there and do it.
Yeah, for some courses where that have, the majority of those adults out of overwintering sites, I would say that that's the time to do it. But again, I've seen a couple courses where that seems to be the case. In other courses, still maybe a week to 2 weeks out from that actually happening.
Okay, so what about the courses that have pyrethroid resistance? Is there anything they can use if they're not going to use Dursban, which may or may not be allowed depending on, is that allowed in New York State, chlorpyrifos?
Yeah, I mean, it's allowed. I think right now, it's basically down to if you have adults that are, well, if you're doing air blast sprays, I think are limited right now. You can't do that, but still you can use something like an organophosphate. So, which I would say is probably a pretty good option if you have something like pyrethroid resistance. Okay. Other cases, if you've got pyrethroid resistance, people are suggesting maybe switching over to maybe focusing on larval applications only. But again, this is a tricky time for that, because if you're in a year where every decision matters and your workforce matters where you're putting their efforts in, right, sinking all your eggs into doing larvicides only can be a pretty risky thing to do. So,
and unless you're interested in having the weevil take out your POA and increase a desirable grass that you'd rather have, and that's the new thinking on the
and there's been some interesting work from Albert Koppenhofer looking at that, possibly where you've got low densities of POA actually using ABW to try and reduce POA in the system. And he even admits there's a lot more work to do in that regard. And I think that'd be a pretty scary endeavor to take on, but one that could be pretty useful.
So let's talk about synchronicity, right? Synchronicity about, the march of the weevil, so to speak. They come out a little bit, they come out more, and then there's a wave of when they come out. And again, like I said, as we've come to learn about curves, right? In this case, we don't want to flatten the curve, or we do want to flatten the curve. Can you talk a little bit about an immediate emergence where they all bunch up and what that would look like versus, something that's prolonged and goes over a long period of time?
Yeah, well, I think one important thing to note about that, the difference you might see there, is if it looks more prolonged, which is kind of what we're seeing right now, that's when you start seeing low numbers and wonder, oh, is this the peak? This must be the peak, but they're a little lower, so it's go time. And then a week later, you actually see what looks more traditionally like a peak. So that can be where it's a little more tricky to actually say what the peak looks like. But I think that's where things like taking into account phenological indicators and say, do these things jive and make sense together, can be really helpful. And we're still seeing, go ahead.
Finish your point.
I was just going to say, with some of those indicators like Forsythia, we're still seeing that most plants are in full bloom or are close to that right now, where we're not seeing alignment with what you typically see with time to apply against adults.
Okay, so the other thing about it, Kyle, is that when they all come out at once, they all feed at once, the damage can be severe. They come out over a longer period of time, maybe the little sporadic bit of feeding might be tolerable if there's less traffic, and the golf courses may get less traffic just by the general spacing we're going to have to do of the tee times and golfers to a certain extent. You'd imagine could mean more carts. I don't want to suggest there's not going to be any stress if we're open during this, but that's the traditional thinking about it, that if it comes out over a long period of time, I might not have to worry about it. But in my head, I'm thinking, well, it was a mild winter. I could have a flattened long curve that has a higher plateau.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and that's a possibility. I haven't been in this as long as some of the other turf entomologists out there, but what we've seen in every year I've done it, that weevil development does catch up at some point, and that's where the staying on your toes component, I think, really does play in here, because No matter how weird the spring has been since I've started, at some point they've caught up, and that larval development always seems to catch up miraculously too, whether it's a slow cold start or a really raging fast start to spring. So so it looks like a lull right now, where things are just kind of idling slowly, but I'm not going to be surprised if it catches up quickly.
Perfect. All right, Carl, we got any questions? Let's have some questions, and then we'll go on to the other part of the time today.
So no questions on ABW yet, Frank. So maybe that's, unless you got any more, maybe it's time to transition.
Okay, happy to do that. Kyle, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Appreciate that. Let me get this right. We'll go right back to the videotape, as Warner Wolf would say. Right back to the videotape. So again, big shout out to all of you that came together to form this New York chapter of the Golf Course Superintendents. What a thrill to be able to do one of the first education events. It's a very weird way to do. We'll always remember it, huh, fellas? So and everyone else. We'll always have this to look back on. All right, so here, this wasn't the talk I was going to give. I wasn't anticipating a global pandemic that shut us down. We're in our 5th week now here where I am. So I thought this would be an apropos time because, I spent a lot of time with an engineer, my colleague and assistant Carl Scamenti, and it's really before that with Bob Portmas, and it's really taught me a lot about how to use data more. And of course, I spent enough time close to Bill Kreiser and his work with Growing Degree Days that this has impressed me as to be a whole way of looking at the way we do it. Now, inherently, we've resisted this. I think, data, Frank. I still got to see the place. I still got to feel things. I still got to smell things and touch it. Yeah, I know. It's good to have sort of intuition that you build from your tactile experiences. You go out there, and your eyes and your ears and your smells and the temperatures and how you feel. I mean, there's no doubt you're touching the soil and measuring moisture. We've done this forever, right? But 2 things are important now. One is we may not have as much as we used to. And so we're going to have to be even more efficient than we used to be, which could include us getting blisters again, right? But also we're going to have to use our resources more efficiently as we move forward. So I think the idea of using data and blending it with your intuition, your inherent understanding, your sort of knowledge of the property, right? No one's saying being data-driven replaces being an intuitive superintendent. But I've also been around long enough to say we tell ourselves a lot of things that's a lot of phony baloney sometimes. And sometimes our eyes can deceive us, right? Sometimes our eyes can deceive us. So I think using data neutralizes that to a certain extent. And it also, of course, in my opinion, will enhance it dramatically. All right, so the topic for today, how do we do this, will allow for reducing labor and resource consumption. I guess that's the way I'm approaching it. To me, that's the value of it, right? You're going to have less labor and resource consumption. I don't think you're going to be, I don't think anybody expects, well, I don't know how people are going to take if that leads to less playable conditions, what that's going to mean. I can't say what that's going to mean. I'm not sure anybody can say what that's going to mean. I think everybody right now, as we're adjusting, is just trying to, well, I'm going to try to get as close to what I usually do. And I'm going to get the greens and everything down the middle as quick as I can. And we've been hearing from the USGA and everybody about that. But essentially, it may be a result of having to deal with these 2 things. All right, how would I approach it if it wasn't a COVID thing? Well, I wanted to talk about where this whole idea comes from. What's the history of it? How do we currently use it? And how do we use it again to help with COVID? Data is facts and stats, right? I mean, we oftentimes say in science, you can torture the data enough and they'll tell you anything. They'll tell you anything if you torture them enough. And the torture of data is statistics, right? We torture it with statistics. Why do we do that? Well, we do it to say, listen, I can't study everything. I got to study this little thing on this little plot of land and then say, well, yeah, this is the way it is everywhere. And we find out that even if that's true in a small plot or in one particular study, 3-4 years, it's not always good for long periods of time. It may not be scalable. So that's the data is not the all perfect situation, but you at least know what it is, that it's a reference point that you can analyze something with. All right. What are you trying to analyze? Well, you're trying to analyze something you can adjust what you're doing and predict moving forward. This is the dance. You know, there's a population epidemiologist that wrote an article called Hammer and the Dance, right? The hammer is the shutdown of our society, and the dance is the little bit we're going to be allowed to re-enter it. If we start to re-enter society the way we did and the curve spikes again, we're all going back home. Right? So we need to be able to adjust what we're doing, predict what's going to happen, and focus on the growth of our situation and the way golf is playing to adjust. And again, I have enormous hope because golf course superintendents are inherently good at this, especially if you're not fighting. Obviously the less financial pain you're experiencing in this situation, the easier it is to absorb a lot of the things I'm talking about. But if your mind is burdened by, I don't know how I'm going to pay 5 guys or 6 guys or 2 guys or buy top dressing or buy my fertilizer or get that some snow molds application, you've got a lot of other things. But if you can determine exactly what you need, use it precisely, it's going to make you more efficient. You're going to get the most out of it. Fundamentally, that's what we're talking about. All right. So this is new to many people. So obviously, you don't start out being a data-driven manager by, I'm getting I'm getting all the statistical. I'm going to do this, right? I'm getting on course. Some of you are already doing this with your workforce. These digital workplace tables. You're already doing some of these things. What do you do? Well, you're looking at. Well, data is describing something that happened. You worked this many hours so far last year, and now you're working this many hours. So when Jonathan says I got 40% of the workforce, he's using the numbers he had last year and the numbers he had this year to describe that says, okay, I got this much less. Well, why did it happen? And how did it happen? And how can I predict what I'm going to need? And how can we improve it? And how do we go from looking back and saying, yeah, I should have done that, to looking forward and saying, yeah, I think this is the right call. And you're not going to feel comfortable about it. I don't see how people are going to be feeling comfortable with making decisions cold anyway, never mind during the pandemic. So this is where data can provide some foundation for your decision making. Anybody who knows me knows I'm in somewhat of a sports depression, not because I really care about any other sport, but man, I miss baseball. Raise your hand if you miss baseball. I miss baseball. I'd be sitting there every night watching it forever. So there we go. That's a boy. I'm telling you, I miss baseball. And if you like baseball like I do, you see how the game has been totally transformed with data, right? And so, you're hitting the ball in different places and you shift and you do these things. And so you see a game completely transformed. So now all the baseball teams are hiring all these data scientists, who then led them to cheat. Ha! I'm not going to brag. Some of these are Cornell IRR grads, but many of us don't have data scientists on our staff at a golf course, right? So how do you manage the sort of overwhelming amount of data? Well, how's the game begun to do this? And listen, I could have given this whole talk about what I've learned watching Carl Scamenti, Lou Stagner, and Mark Brody, and whoever else is interested in the geekness of shots and the game of golf. I mean, we could go down that wormhole, but you see how these things are being implicated by officials and by players. Players are, you can put this thing on your club and put your iWatch on, and then it gives you your data of where you normally hit and how your shots are and what's the right way to approach the pin. And then it gives you follow-up stats at the end. So I don't know how many of your golfers are using these things, but these things are out there. The PGA Tour and its strokes gained things, you ask, my pal Carl here, a picture that describes his life. He sends the thing that aligns club speed with driving distance as the most important thing. And anybody that watches Carl swing will know exactly what I'm talking about. So obviously there's a generation of your players that are going to come up and want to use your golf courses that are thinking about this. All right. So how do we currently use data just for normal things? And let's talk about ways of using this during COVID as well. Well, we currently use data for nutrient management, and are you balancing ions or are you using minimum sufficiency levels? You know, did you look at the GCSA survey that said if you soil test more, you tend to apply more fertilizer? And I think many of us would say if you followed minimum levels approach, you wouldn't apply that much fertilizer. So sometimes nutrient analysis takes us down the wrong road. I'm not suggesting all data is good. You have to discriminate. Like, and how do you convert data? Right? Everybody uses the Spectrum 300. You get percent volumetric. What's your number? 20, 15, 10, whatever it is, right? And then you say, well, all right, how much water? I don't know, 5 minutes. How do you do that conversion? I've never heard about that conversion. So obviously you're doing some data right now. You're your own walking computers. And then, of course, in a more serious note, how do we use the growth regulator knowledge that we've amassed that Bill's been developing quietly for the last decade that surprisingly very few people still use or even know about? And how do we use all this stuff during COVID? All right. So, I'm very fond of the minimum levels for sustainable nutrition. Is really probably our best practice, our best management practice is to use this guideline in managing your soil nutrient levels and determine from here what you need and try to diagnose any potential problems you might have. Now, at the same time, you see people bragging about using things like phosphorus deficiency for growth management. No one's playing. You don't want to manage it, right? Or if you're playing and you want to keep it healthy, you don't have to over apply. You see, if you go from 3 part per million to 5 part per million, very little changes. But then as soon as you get to 7 part per million and above, you're perfectly green. It's like a light switch. Now, I don't presume to know this, but this is the kind of data many of us should be using. We should be expanding this data and mapping our soils. Now, I don't presume to think anybody's going to run out and do this now. But when we did this work at the Robert Trent Jones Golf Course a number of years ago with Andy Matulowicz and Helena and their RX 360 mapping plan, we did this when they were dragging the plates around. Now they're dragging the sled with an electromagnetic induction device. That's a different thing. But no matter how you get the data, it's how you interpret it. If you here's your soil test levels for Malic 3, right? And even if you just use our old sufficiency levels that we used to use at Cornell 10 years ago, you'd have treated 70% of that fairway, right? So now if you use the MLSN, we didn't have to put any phosphorus on. So these large scale applications are what's going to get the hardest to do. So why do it just because you've always done it? Why not do it based on data? Moisture is, of course, to me, the gold standard, either the Spectrum, I like the in-ground ones. Can you find moisture management that allows the plants to grow just at the rate you'd like them to? Wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to send the fairway mowers out in June and July, but one time a week? Is there a way you can use moisture management and wetting agents to allow those longer, drier periods, right? Whether you're buying water or not, right? I mean, one of the things you don't want is these things growing like crazy if you don't need them to. Now, of course, the industry standard now for the way growth regulators should be applied and the many, many hundreds and hundreds of algorithms and models that Bill's built for the different grasses that we've talked about in these webinars, this is the foundation for using plant growth regulators. I would go so far as to say if you're not using them this way, you're not using them right. So I guess you could say, well, I don't follow this, but I sort of do. Well, I don't know what sort of means. I mean, I think there is wiggle room, Bill will tell you, in the way you can do this, but you shouldn't let it go into rebounds, especially in a year like this. Now, Bill's, of course, got the Greenkeeper app that tracks all this for you. Big shout out to him and Doug and the webinars that they're doing. This is a great place to be mindful of data-driven stuff. Listen, you can't use data just by looking at stuff. You have to find ways to bring it together, manage it, see it in a readable form so that you can interpret and make a decision. So however they visualize it, whether it's Greenkeeper or it's Greg Wojcik playbooks, whether it's playbooks or Greenkeeper, On Course, whatever one you're using, right? How are they visualizing that data that's making it easier to make your decisions? That's how you know you got good data. What data do I need? How do I put it together? And then what do I do when I'm looking at it like this? And we're going to get into that even further. All right. So what are emerging methods of using data? What are ways that we can look at these factors, playability, growth, and pests, right? During this global pandemic, right? And adjust things and determine things that are going to then lead to us providing known targets for plainness, right? We know how to measure green speed. I didn't put green speed in there. It's so old, right? We know how to measure green speed, but now we're measuring firmness and trueness. Does that matter? Can we adjust it? What do the golfers think? Does it help with traffic tolerance? Should we be doing that? What about growth, nutrient demand, and traffic, right? You just want as much growth and nutrients to support that growth that keep up with your traffic needs. Now, those traffic needs may be as minimal as whatever maintenance traffic you have, or as maybe as you got 200 rounds today, right? And 200 rounds on any day causes trouble. Well, how are we doing that? And we'll go through, of course, some data about clipping volume. If you're not doing it, we'll encourage you to begin to do it, even though you might say, well, how am I going to do it now? I got less time. Well, my experience has been guys have figured out how to do it with not taking much time. Now, from a pest perspective, and this is where we'll spend a little bit more time, I know this is where a lot of our research has gone, and what got me thinking about this even more was the ways we've used data to deal with the things like we were just talking about with Kyle, as well as environmental risk and risk of the pest. All right. So recently, Micah Woods, Cornell grad Micah Woods at the Asian Turf Center, tweeted out some surface hardness of 8 grass species on putting greens, right? Where he's dropped the Clegg hammer, what did he say? Almost 3,000 Clegg drops on 106 golf courses. Right now, you can see sometime, he doesn't have as many of each of these, and you can look at the data and find out more. But it's very interesting to see how these firmness things look. Now, there's lots of ways of looking at this data, and what is this drop? It could be related to not many courses, I've heard people say, right? So, but you see, parkland golf courses with a lot of annual bluegrass might have softer greens, and fescue golf courses out in the wide open with more sandy places may have firmer greens. All right. And then Paul Graham was so kind to provide some of the STRI data that was also sort of tweeted back at Micah about parkland golf courses and links golf courses. I think it's interesting to denote where they're measuring organic matter. You're talking about the top inch. This isn't the typical way we measure organic matter in our, what people refer to as ISTRIC tests. That's actually just an undisturbed core analysis. That undisturbed core analysis typically gives us the organic matter in the top, 0 to 60 millimeters or 75 millimeters, 3 inches, right? So look at this data and understand, what does this mean? What am I trying to do? And then ultimately, let's talk a little bit about managing growth, right? This is the little pamphlet Micah wrote. The hashtag on Twitter has a collection of solutions that superintendents have come up with to do this easily. So why is this important to do? What have we learned from our own way of doing it at Cornell? Now, I've talked about this in the past to some of you in the field. The black bars are the rainfall, and this was 2 years ago in 2018. Right? So 2 years ago, we had a fair amount of rain. We had a fair amount of rain last year. Dave Hicks, our golf course superintendent, the Robert Trent Jones Golf Course, with Carl Scamenti and the employee who does the greens mowing in the morning, we're collecting the clippings from 2 different putting greens, right? And so you're looking at the 5-day growth average for the 2 greens and the rainfall amounts. And then one of the things you begin to notice when you start to look at data is if you look carefully, you see the rainfall and a bit of a peak, and you see persistent rainfall and you see a peak. Now you see some rain, you see persistent rainfall and you see a little peak. You see some rainfall and you see a smaller peak. Now, obviously, as you get into the fall, temperatures go down, right? So it's cooler, right? But in the heat of the summer, on a growth regulator program, right, just going through without making any adjustments, look at the clipping volume 4-fold over the, or three or fourfold over the recommended 10 to 15 milliliters per square meter, right? Tied up with rainfall, which is a measure, of course, of, to a certain extent, the mineralization of nitrogen and the availability of nitrogen. Now, looking at two greens, we could see there were some differences between the two. Looked like the POA green, our fifth green, with more annual bluegrass, more shade, less air, got going early. We've seen some different responses depending on the growing season, but we're not making any adjustments yet. We're just looking at the data. Well, Dave eventually wanted to look at, well, what do I want during a tournament, right? So he gears up every year for the high school tournament at the RTJ. And we were looking at clipping volume, and he really liked how it performed when the clipping volume was in this range here. And it made me think, as I was putting this together, wow, wouldn't that be sort of what we'd want for COVID as a baseline if we don't want to grow that much? Well, there's also a range that I'm not using here that Dave talks about, playing, not COVID or not low growth or championship conditions where I don't want the grass growing very much, right? But what's happening when I'm getting play? What kind of growth do I need so I can target and tailor my nutrient management, my growth regulators, my moisture management, if you have control of it, right? What this graph is saying here is sometimes you don't have control of it. It's moisture. And even if you're using growth regulators on a model like we were using, we still don't have control. You might have microclimate differences. It's hard to get control. So start to take the data and diagnose what you want based on the traffic that's out there. Now, I put this in here. Carl's done some work looking at the mapping and how it might help. And I was wondering about this. Now that if you had 40 carts, you could accommodate 80 golfers. Well, now, unless those people are related or they start putting plastic dividers in carts, you're going to have 40 carts, you're going to have 40 golfers. I don't know what that's going to do or not going to do, or if you're going to want to increase your volume. Let's say I still got to have 80 golfers. Now you got 80 carts. Where are they going? What are they doing? How do I target my nutrients based on where the carts are going? A very, maybe some would consider minor, but I would say this is probably where some of the biggest traffic pressure is going to come from, because this is the part that could go up. And especially if we're starving for revenue, we're going to try to accommodate, in my opinion, as many carts as we possibly can, because obviously the profit margin is pretty good on carts. All right, let me get to some of the ways we've used data to manage. How are we doing on time? All right, 10 minutes. I'm doing pretty good. All right. Many of you know we started this project a long time ago with the state parks here in New York State. We've continued to monitor the golf courses over the last 10, 12 years on a wider scale. And what we've demonstrated is we've used data to reduce risk associated with pest management. So we just said we can't have this much risk on our state park golf courses for their pest management programs. So as many of you know, and I don't have to go into, we use the environmental impact quotient, one of the many risk models that are available. And I believe you're going to hear a lot more about models in the future. Carl and Michael Beckin, Doug Soldat, and I are collaborating on a paper we're presenting at the international conference. Michael Beckin and Carl leading the way here on this work. Michael for his PhD at the University of Wisconsin. And they're looking at ways of looking at environmental risk and weaknesses and strengths and ways of using these models that are going to be important moving forward. Playbooks has incorporated it into their system. So again, if you're going to have data, you're going to use data, it's be good to have an easy way to access it. And so hopefully the platforms continue to integrate this into their use. Now, you can play around with all the data I want, but ultimately the data most people care about after cost is, does it work? It might even be, does it work? And then how much does it cost? And of course, you all know we have the wonderful resource from the University of Kentucky that we talked about last week that's been updated by Greg Munshaw, Bruce Clark, Paul Koch, right? Updated the most recent Vincelia, the PPA1, with the efficacy chart based on research. So what are we doing with the state park? Reducing environmental risk, all right? We figured out from mining data that if we could target what our problems were and find strategies to reduce its use, we'd be able to reduce overall risk. And one of the first things we found from understanding our risk on our pesticide use was 2 pests accounted for as much as 60% of the total risk associated with pest management on state park golf courses in 2014. You can see it went from 51 to 57%, right? So 2 pests accounted for 60% of our overall environmental risk. So we said, maybe we should reduce our risk associated with annual bluegrass weevil, and we did. And we have 2 methods we used, IPM for both, and especially for dollar spot risk reduction models. All right, what are you currently doing? Well, Ben and Albrecht did a survey many years ago, and they said the average number in the metropolitan New York area, number of fairways damaged is 9, tees is almost 8, greens and collars is almost 6, and many of you are making about 5.5 pesticide applications on Long Island golf courses, right? So if we're talking about our data at Bethpage, this would be different everywhere, but that's a hot spot down there. So what did we do? Well, we started looking. You know, Mike Hadley was able to scout just the other day and get us numbers. If you're not scouting, if you're not using people like, you know, Rod Ferrantino or other companies that come and do scouting, if you're not paying attention to models and going and looking at your own property, that's the first place to start. That's the first place to start, is where is that peak? We were just talking about it with Kyle about the peak. Well, you don't know if you're not out looking. You got to keep those records, and then you choose products that are least toxic at the best time. Now, the implementation of this trial that we did was, you could see we started out with risk units as high as 2,900. If you look simply at the let me go back. If you look simply at the EIQ in 2012, we were as high as 2,900. We were treating as many as 39 acres. We were treating as many as 39 acres, and we were making almost 4 applications a year. And over time, you can see acreage, risk, and number of applications have all declined. Why did we even know to do this? We knew it because we started looking at data. The EIQ was a good place to start, but many of you know your area treated and the number of applications that you're making. So we were able to drive down the risk of the products we were using over a period of time, as well as treating less acreage. And that is how you reduce pesticide use, no matter what your pest is. You use least toxic materials on smaller amounts of land. Now, one surefire way to reduce the need for many applications is a GPS sprayer. And we've worked with the Frost Incorporated people. We've worked with Frost Inc., Ken Rost out in Minnesota, on attaching this to the sprayer at Skinny Atlas Golf Club. Alex Hammond up there running the facility. You can see how the machine comes on and off. And when we got there in 2017, they were treating 29 acres. And in 2018, we treated only 24 acres. So just by geometry, they saw a 17% reduction. That's an easy way to do it, especially if you're trying to minimize use. It took them less time significantly. They were spraying at very high volume at very slow ground speed. So we were able to realize an enormous reduction. And when you put all these things together, every time you spray, you spray less acreage, you spray less toxic materials, you put less pesticides on the ground, all of a sudden you're looking at 450 pounds. Now, maybe before the global pandemic, that didn't matter, but maybe every pound's gonna matter now. So the end of my presentation talks about using risk models. Now, we've been at this for a while. For those of you who do or don't use our forecast website, a lot of that work we started to do because there were some dollar spot models that were available that we were playing around with before Smith Kearns. And we also had done some weather climate data that we published back in 2007 that says the weather's getting more conducive for dollar spot, especially in the fall, especially in the latter part of the season. Now, we were very fortunate that some more research was done and the Smith Kearns model was brought to the forefront. And listen, if you're managing fairways in the Northeastern United States, if you're a New York golf course superintendent, I can't imagine there's a disease you spray more for than dollar spot on your fairways, both in the volume and the number of sprays that you make. And if you're thinking about this, that's when this is most important. If we're talking about pest management on your putting surfaces, a lot of this stuff goes out the window. You're going to have to focus all the resources you have on keeping those playing surfaces right around in your surrounds as manicured as you can possibly get. I think it's these large scale applications that if we have the luxury to make them for a period of time, that it behooves us to use these models. And I'm looking at how we were back in 2011. Carl's done a number of things looking at the amount of dollar spot pressure that we've had. Now, one of the things that's important when you use these models is the threshold that you use, right? 30, 20%. If you have a resistant variety, if you have a new grass in there, and this might be something to consider if this whole pandemic challenges you to think about regrassing, why not plant disease-resistant bent grasses or gray leaf spot resistant ryegrasses that now allow you to have thresholds in the 50 to 60% range, and you think about the number of applications you have to make when your threshold before disease comes about is much higher because you've got variety tolerance, you've got disease resistance in your variety. So again, how you set the threshold, how much time you spend on it. And then the other thing that we've learned more recently is the slope of the line matters. If the slope of the line on the 5-day rolling average is on a steep incline, you can assume, and let's go back here for a second. You see how this works with, you're getting a steep incline here where the pressure's really bad. But thankfully, you've made your first fungicide application, right? So now you go out 28 days. You don't really have to pay attention to the model. I would hope you get 28 days out of it. Let's hope you do. That would mean that you're not, going to need it until here. And the model's saying you're not too bad. Now, all of a sudden, you start to see here and here the slope's going, right? So it looks like, and of course, you can come to our forecast website and other places, that the line is getting steep. So you bought yourself, what, a week, 7 days. You bought yourself 7 days and not having a treat by using the model, a 28-day material, paying attention to the slope of the line. I got 7 more days. Look historically. We have these models. It's something that's possible to do. We do a lot of this because of our interaction with the state park golf courses on Long Island. But you can see how the pressure is greater on Long Island in general. This is the average dollar spot pressure across the months of the year. Here we are in April and May. The probability is very low, but soon will be higher, right? Soon will be higher. How many times are you more than a month where you need 30 days of control? Well, if you're on Long Island, you had 50 days, you're applying on the set interval. If it's 21 days, you're applying on the 20th day. 21st day. You're not waiting till 22, 23 unless you know you have the models to cover you. Now, as I wrap up, I'll just remind you that the world we're going to live in may include us getting these notices on our phone every day that says, hey, I just looked at the parameters. You're going to set all the parameters. Where are you? What kinds of grasses do you have? Do you have a history of these problems? And then it's going to look at what it is today and what it's going to be for the next few days. And it's going to say the your disease risk is low. It's going to be connected to your last application. And it's going to say your preventative is still effective. You're good. You don't need to send anybody in today. The soil moisture is adequate and it looks like it's going to be so. Nobody into water today. Crabgrass germination is still about 3 days away. All right, I better get my pre down or I'm going to target where I'm going to do it. This is the world that's going to make the workforce, the automation, all the things that are coming as a result of this more important. And I didn't even touch on things like, labor deployment and daily course setup, innovations in how we're going to apply things, integrating these things. So just as we wrap up and maybe take some questions, Carl, thank you all very much. And maybe, Carl, you put up the slide of the sponsors again, and we take any questions if there are any. We're right at the witching hour.
One note, Dave was just saying that Doug Soldat does have a clipping volume Excel spreadsheet on his Wisconsin turfgrass website. So if you guys want the clipping volume spreadsheet he has, you can go find that.
I can
But
hear
other than that, no questions.
no questions. Did I do that good, or I see you sure, or you're answering them?
No questions. Just actually one from Chris Richter. What was that resource about the cart sanitation BMPs? I think it was from New Jersey.
Yeah, the New Jersey Superintendents, if you go to their COVID website, you drill into it and you'll see there's some best practices there. And I actually think this is written by the Easy Go people, that they're working with the Jersey Association. And I think, Carl, this is really important that we get together, that guys growing grass get together with people who run Clubhouse, and we got to have a coordinated effort for what are the best practices for keeping everybody safe. If we're gonna not want to do the dance, open and then close, if the more we have these standard operating procedures in place, the more we're going to be able to do the dance and stay dancing as a medical solution comes to pass.
Yeah. Yeah. So no other questions. Again, just a quick shout out, Frank. I'm going to share my screen with
one more time.
Yeah, just to recognize all the sponsors who made this happen, right? So again, Andre and Son, Grassland, Harold's, First Turf and Ornamental, those are the platinum sponsors. Gold sponsors, Finch Turf, Pump Irrigation Technologies, BASF, MTE. And then the silver sponsors, Syngenta, Nutrient Solutions, Ewing, Turf and Soil, Weaver, and Dryjex. Again, thanks, guys. And we'll be back again next week with the second version of the webinar series, second episode. Doug Soldat, who is actually on today, he'll be talking about a little bit more in depth about clipping volume, nitrogen, optimizing those things, again, with an eye on COVID. So
thanks very much, Carl. See you later.
See everybody.
Take care, everybody.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.